Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. This morning, our amazing volunteer, Terri Meeks, will be talking about how to read that old script in deciphering handwriting. But before I turn it over to Terri, I just wanted to go over a few general housekeeping notes and some announcements. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to share during the program, please type them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we will make sure all of your questions are addressed at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to test that feature now, please type hello so we know that you can hear us. We also want to invite you to join us for our next Feature Friday event on July 1st at Centennial Park from 4:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. July's theme for the sesquicentennial event is recreation, which will feature whitewater entertainment in the river, fly fishing demonstrations, whitewater safety demonstrations from the Royal Gorge Gargoyle rafting team, a rock climbing wall for the adventurous souls, and music and food trucks for those less adventurous out there. Fremont Search and Rescue will have a tent along with Fremont Historical Society will be selling their self-guided tours. Master Gardeners will also have a tent there, and the museum will be passing out self-guided tours of South Canyon for free. Our friends in the museum will also be selling their Royal Gorge bricks for their fundraising event. So please join us for a fun evening of recreating at our appropriately named Centennial Park. Our next virtual genealogy program with Terri will be on Maps on July 16th. The museum will be posting our online registration for that program in the coming weeks. So please stay tuned. And again, thank you for joining us. And I will now turn it over to Terri.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. It's good to see you again this morning. And we are welcoming you to deciphering some handwriting. I'm sure if you have done genealogy for any period of time, you have collected documents, and you might have run into one or two that we would classify as written in chicken scratches. So we're going to take a look at some of the methods as well as some of the history of handwriting, and hopefully provide tips for you so that you can decipher those mysterious words. The actual study of handwriting is called paleography, and it deals with either analyzing ancient symbols or the more modern, and deciphering and dating historical documents, essentially reading old handwriting in its various forms. Handwriting was initially developed to preserve information. In medieval times, information was passed orally, and for many centuries, information was passed orally. And people discovered that handwriting was another way to transmit information, especially as the world grew and trade developed. It became necessary to communicate with other tribes, other groups of people, other regions, as well as other countries. It was a prized art form, and it did require actual training. So until the 1800s, probably here, definitely here in the United States or in the colonies, but also as in Europe, documents were written by what were called professional penmen. And even our Declaration of Independence was written by a professional penman. Handwriting was a mark of intelligence as well as good social standing, and obviously for that reason would be highly valued. Originally, handwriting, we have typesetting of the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible in the 1400s. But cursive came along. It made it faster to write by linking the letters together and having them flow one into the other. In the 16 and 1700s, pens were made out of various articles, quills, and they had nibs. So every time in printing that you lifted the pen and put it back down, you had the chance of an ink blob or breaking the pen nib. So this cursive became a much more flowing style, which allowed to decrease both of those faults. Let's look at some examples of some early handwriting. The first one I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about, I'm talking primarily about those that were developed in the Western European countries, not other languages or other alphabets. So the first one we have is Carolingian minuscule, named after Charlemagne. And he was the one that recognized the need to standardize writing. As I said, when trade developed, they needed to be able to communicate with other people in other areas. So in the late 700s, Charles, appointed an English monk to come up with lettering practices and to oversee those. And they were taught for the most part to monks in monasteries. And we see large capital letters for the first time used at the beginning of sentences. So we're getting a delineation now. And the Roman alphabet was in existence at that time, and the lowercase letters were then used following that capital. Here's an example of Carolingian minuscule. And for those of you that may have traced your ancestry back to 900 or so, this was the style of handwriting that would have been in place at that time. Many of these documents have been studied, translated as need, and transcribed as needed. So we do get some of that information nowadays, but I doubt that any of us have actually done the research this far back. Secretary's hand developed in the early 16th century, and it was pretty much throughout Western Europe. It was common in the late 1500s through the 1700s. I called out the British Isles and Germany in particular, but know that France and Italy also adopted the secretary hand as a form of writing. We've talked about business travel and personal correspondence are now entering the field. And this hand made it easier to communicate in writing via those vast distances. And here is an example of that. To me, it's far less legible, but if you know the system and the formation of the letters, you can decipher the handwriting. By the mid-1800s, we get what we call Spencerian script, named after Platt Rogers Spencer. Here again, the idea of fast and legible came into requirements. And this system was adopted in schools, and it was used for a relatively long period of time, 75 years, in the United States. And this was the standard style prior to the adoption of the typewriter. And we noticed the very flowy, and especially those capital letters and the final letters, the curlicues that are appended to each of these. The handwriting is beautiful, but sometimes illegible. Many of us grew up learning the Palmer method. It was developed in 1888 by Austin Palmer, and it was used well into almost the 1950s. It was a simplified style. We got rid of those curlicues at the beginning and end of words. And here again, speed and clarity were the most important features. And by this point, the typewriter had been invented. So this style of writing was competing with the typewriter. And this chart may look very familiar to those of us that grew up during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This was the standard teaching tool at the time in American schools. That fell by the wayside later on, probably in the 60s, with something called the New American Cursive. And it simplified everything, and it completely eliminated those strokes and extra loops. So we noticed, for example, on the R, we don't have the curve that comes up on it. The T is very simplified. So this is the standard that is used today. And as we all know, cursive, for the most part, has gone by the wayside in schools. And when we look at some of the handwriting examples that we'll see today and realize how difficult it is for us to diagnose them, it's going to be interesting to see what the current generation is able to do in future years as far as analyzing old handwriting. So what are some of the problems and challenges that you have run into, and how can we overcome them? In most cases, the documents that we are reading are not the originals. In many cases, we are downloading them from the internet or have obtained copies from either courthouses or other areas, made copies from books. So we're not looking at an original. What was the penmanship of the original author like? If the original author did not have clear, distinct handwriting, we need to try and overcome that in the reading. In early documents, we see a lot of abbreviations and spelling variations, but we also find unfinished words. We may find the first 3 letters of a word, or a sentence may be unfinished. Many of the documents, because they are not originals, or even the original, might be faded, stained, fuzzy, might have been torn or broken, might have been folded and left a stain. So, and some of the images that we can obtain from courthouses or even online may be negative. In other words, they have a black background with white writing, as opposed to the positive images that we are used to seeing. I will make a note on this that in family search, when you find a document that might be a negative image, in the upper left-hand corner of the image, they have the ability to enlarge it or make it smaller. But in Family Search, they also have the ability to change it from a negative to a positive, and vice versa. If it's a positive image, they can make it negative, and that might help you to analyze the handwriting. And depending on where you're working, you might have a language disadvantage that you have to overcome. So here is an example of a marriage record from a Quaker congregation. And we see bleed through from the backside of the page. So you want to try and figure out what this says. One of the easiest ways is to get another clear sheet of paper and put it underneath, so you're just looking at one single line of the text. Another tip when looking at these types of records is to try to read it out loud, or try to at least pronounce it quietly or silently. So we have Zachariah Puckett and Patience Cox. Propose, and look at our P's. Marriage with each other. Mary Moffat and Mary Mills are appointed. And it might take you more than one time to go through these to discover what the letters and words say. To inquire into the young man's, no apostrophe, clearness, our double S, relative to marriage engagement with others, and report to next meeting. The rest of this does not apply to that marriage record. So it may take several readings, and it may take taking the time to write out what you think this says. Leave blanks for the words or the letters that you can't figure out, and put it aside for a while. Don't try to work on it for hours. Come back to it with fresh eyes and see if you can decipher more. This is a letter from Sam Houston. And at the time, you have to remember that paper and ink were in short supply and were very expensive. Sam Houston used this technique multiple times, in that he wrote the front side of the paper in one hand, and then he would change direction on the back side of the page to continue the letter. There are also examples where people use different color inks to do virtually the same thing, to communicate and finish with only using one sheet of paper. So don't be surprised if you run into something like this as well. I think the contrast is probably a little bit better for you at home than it is for me in the light here, but you may have this, the handwriting on this is extremely clear and extremely precise, so there's no difficulty in the lettering, but it may be a faded copy. And by simply blowing up this image, especially if you have it on your computer or if it's at home, using a magnifying glass to blow up the image to see if it becomes clearer or brighter. Sometimes also making the image smaller helps in order to decipher. This is one of those negative images Fortunately, it's a pre-printed form so that you can make out most of that. And it's just a matter of figuring out what the inserts say. As I mentioned earlier, if it's online, and especially at Family Search, I assume that Ancestry might have the same capability. You can turn this into a positive image and see if you get better, more legible contrast. So when looking at our various documents, think about what type of document it is. Is it a census document that you're trying to decipher the handwriting? Or is it actually a full text document like a will or a land deed? Where did the document take place? Where was it written? What is the location of that document? And sometimes that will help you to determine format that might be used. For example, deeds in different states had different rules and different laws for recording land transactions, etc. So knowing what state you were in and what your locality was may help you to find either a format or looking at other documents of similar type. What style or vocabulary do you expect? So here again, when you're talking about a land deed, you expect to see the words indenture. Somebody is going into debt to purchase the land. You're going to expect to see who is selling and who is buying, a date, the amount of money that is involved in the transaction. So is there some kind of format to the document that might help you in transcribing this? And of course, one of the easiest things is, does a transcription already exist? And in some cases, it does. Here's an example that I have found. This is actually from my own family, and it is a baptism record. So I know that it's going to follow a specific format. As we mentioned, is there a transcription? And yes, there is. I did not find the transcription until after I had labored over trying to figure it out. But we see and we can identify and match. We see October, we see 1598, we see Marguerite, the daughter of. So we've got the transcription, we can match that the transcription is correctly done, even though spellings are different. And of course, one of the things to overcome is language. This one happens to be in French. So we've got all of these complications. And because it's in the 1500s and we recognize that style of writing, that it's the it's the secretary hand. So the first thing is to make an attempt to read the entire document. Pick out those keywords, especially if it's supposed to follow a format. I don't know about you, but in looking at documents, I can usually pick out my family's names. Those somehow jump out at me. So try to pick out the names that are involved in the document. Ask yourself, do you need to decipher the entire document? Is it something that perhaps you just, like a land record, where you just need to know the date, the people involved, the money that is going to be exchanged and the terms of that? And especially with meets and bounds areas, do you really need the entire description of the land? You know, starting at the old oak tree, walk so many feet or so many rods, and then turn north. So ask yourself, do you need to know everything that is in the document? Work for a little while. Take your time. Write down the words that you do know. You may get whole sentences, you may get fragments, but you want to come back and try and pick up more words and continue this process in a cycle. Read, write, repeat. And if all else fails, don't forget, ask. Ask for help. Show it to someone else and see if another set of eyes can help you figure out what it says. Many Facebook organizations, for example, there are genealogical Facebook pages that where you can post or you can scan and copy the document and you can ask for help and people will reply to you. So we've already talked about just trying to identify the type of document that you're seeing. In many cases, it might be a simple listing, a census record with the names, and these are all going to have some form of transcription. Whether you find it online with Ancestry or Family Search, in order to create the index, they have had to transcribe at a minimum the name. Now, they may not have gotten it exactly right, but it helps you and guides you to the actual document. In many cases, especially on Ancestry, they have analyzed all of the fields in the records, but it may just be the name field, and it's up to you to decipher what the rest of the document says. So we're going to take a look at some of these. Here is a census document from, I believe it's the 1880s. And we see like Michael Brine and his wife, Eliza. But look at the formation of the M. Look at the same formation for a W. This is William. So we want to look carefully at the actual formation of the letters. Here's that W again, and here's that loopy, that M. We have John Butler and Bridget. We have Patrick Carty, and we have Bartholomew. It's Neelis, his wife, Mary, Michael, David, or Daniel, and others. Now, sometimes the occupations will help you. This happens to be from a town that had a lot of mills in it. So in this particular case, this gentleman is a varnisher. And look at that R, because we see a tailor and we see a very different R. His wife, I assume it's his wife, is a tailoress, the double S. We have a laborer, a different shaped R. So a third R, all recorded by the same enumerator. We have a shirt maker, just a simple laborer. Here again, those different R's. And a chair maker. If you can't make out a name, look at the other names on a page and see if you can't decipher the N's versus the M's, etc. Now, when talking about a transcription, I am going to call particular attention to this name. It happens to be in my family, Neillis, N-E-I-L-I-S. But he came out being Niles. Whereas we see N-E-I when we know it. So pay attention to not only the actual record, but is the transcription true and valid? We have ship lists, more list type documents where the names of people have been called out or transcribed in order to index them and get the information posted. But there's other information on the page, not so much on this one, but we're talking about the amount of luggage that they have and where they are going to. So try to make efforts to decipher this. In later years, ship lists are on 2 pages. You might get the name, their ages, sex, where they're from, what their occupations were and where they're going to, but you get a second page as well that gives further information. So you would have a name over here, and apparently this person is the father of someone. We get relationships. He's going to cousin Michelle Del Duca and an address, and it's in care of a family name. And I think that's Buchanan. The next person has a brother, John Madonna, who lives in Brookside, Colorado. Another one, brother Joseph Del Pizzo, Brookside, Colorado. Cousin. So you've got family relationships on this second page, and much of this stuff is not provided by an ancestry or a family search transcription. So you need to do the work and decipher all those different names. This happens to be a ship list that many Italians were on the ship. So a language barrier may exist as well. Recognizing the names, the Italian names. A birth index. This one happens to be relatively clear. We have October 22nd of 1887, and the name of the child is going to be Richard Yearsley Clark, his father, his mother, what the father's occupation is, and other recording information. What was the date of the recording or the birth and who was in attendance? This one is pretty good. We've got Bennett. So we can pretty much decipher the handwriting on this. But here again, look for similar things. We have a single person that is recording this information, but his handwriting is a little bit different in each of the examples. So if you can't decipher a name, look for the formation of the B's, for example, or how did they record T's throughout? Military lists. They have the same thing. For the most part, you get a listing of those that are registering for military service. Their ages, their middle initials, their ages. where they are actually enlisting, and who is the agent who is doing the enlisting. Where were they born? I think this was the date and this is their age. And what was their previous occupation, and a physical description, what their eyes, hair, and complexion look like. This is another one that has 2 pages. So when you go straight across on something, you also want to read the 2nd page. And because this is military, we see a lot of abbreviations. For the most part, these people are all discharged from the service. You might also find those that may have died and or deserted, any kind of notation. And it usually gives a month and a year of when they left, as well as the reason. They have an expiration of service, General Order 80. So it's important to understand the format of the document to know what these abbreviations and what this stands for. He's being discharged from the Presidio in San Francisco, California. He was a private with excellent conduct. Whipple Barracks, Arizona Territory. So knowing the time frame as well as the geography of the United States at the time will help you. We also have documents that have a predetermined format. We have some of those church and vital records, tombstones. We know what to expect when seeing a tombstone, hopefully. And we have wills and other probate records, as well as deeds and other property transactions. And for the most part, they do follow some kind of format. For church and vital records, you want the date, who are the main characters involved. You know, if it's a birth, what is the child's name? Who potentially are the parents' names? The same with a baptism. And who are the witnesses to the baptism? Because those are probably relatives. Marriages, we're going to get the date and we're going to get the names of the 2 parties. We hope for the names of the parents, but we don't always get those. In fact, I have found them rarely. And the same with deaths and burials. We get the name of the person and the date of their decease or of their burial, not necessarily both. But hopefully there may be other pertinent details in the form that you can decipher. So the first thing is to determine what kind of document you have. And just by doing a brief scan, we see baptism. We see the word baptized. So we probably have a format. In the margin, we have the name. And when I first looked at this, I ignored the marginal note, but I thought born to, and I had a little bit of trouble figuring out this. And I thought the name was Martin. You got that nice M. But in looking over at the side, the name is actually Baxter. So this is where you have to compare with other parts of the document. In the village of Livingstone on the, I believe it's the 28th, and I actually had to recite the names of the months to determine that this was December. DEC, and that's a little R up there. So, April, May, June, those don't fit in with that format. So it's December of 1805 and baptized on the 26th of February, 1807. This child at the time of its baptism could not find a father. Her mother gave it to and I had trouble figuring out this. I thought it was a town, but it's with the A there. I realized that it's a pack-man, which she said came up to her on the road from Edinburgh. We just see EIDN and an abbreviation for the borough. So here again, knowing where the document was written and recorded is important to figure out some of the text. Though the father was suspected to be nearer I still have not figured out that word, but confession. There's FESS. From the time it was born to the day could not be extorted. Took me a long time to figure that from the mother. So it's one of those cases where you read the document aloud, you record what you have been able to figure out, underline or leave blank those areas that you can't figure out, and go back. This is a marriage license, and we're going to blow it up a little bit. We're going to look at the Harmon, and is this Nettie or is it Nellie? There's a brief little cross on it, so I think it's actually a T. And if it was your family, you would probably recognize the names. Here is a death from a church. On the 12th day of April, 1832, Sepha Whitcomb, wife of Lyman Knowlton, Esquire of Stokely, died at 58 years, 3 months, and was buried on the 15th day of the same month in presence of the subscribing witnesses. So take the time to peruse, look at other forms to see if it's using the same format, etc. Here's another one that is a list. It's a list of burials, but here again, we have language. This happens to be written in Latin. So knowing a little bit of, or going to Google Translate will help you to figure out and decipher this. He was born on the 15th October. He died on the 15th of October, and he actually was born today. So this is an infant that was born and died on the same day. Tombstones. You're going to have the name of the main character. Hopefully you're going to have dates. Sometimes you'll have ages. And we've all run into either the broken or with weathered tombstones that have lost their clarity, and sometimes they are stained. Here is a tombstone for S.L. Goddard, and actually this is a cenotaph that is in an Ohio cemetery, and it says that he is buried at Natchez, Mississippi on June 3rd, 1840, 32 years of age. The cemetery is in Ohio. He's actually buried in Mississippi. because looking for a supporting document, he was killed in a tornado. It was a massive tornado in Natchez, Mississippi at the time. Here's another one that's broken and barely can make out. Can't make out. We just have the ALL. Look for a supporting document. Is this cemetery recorded in Find a Grave, where someone else may have had access to cemetery records that could lead you to further information to decipher this tombstone. Language again. This is a Hebrew, so a Jewish person, and look for symbology on tombstones as well. Wills and probate records. In many cases, we don't get the original will. We may get a transcription of the will that is recorded in the probate records. But if we're actually looking at the will, we want to see, in the name of God, amen, being of sound mind and body. Who are the beneficiaries, the dates, and there are other documents that appear in probate records for us to examine. I found this one online because it wound up being a court case. Many of you may be familiar with the artist Thomas Kincaid. And this is his supposedly last will and testament. And because of the content of the will, as well as the illegibility of it, seeing that he was an artist, I find this fascinating. Because of the illegibility and actually the fact that he's leaving not to his family, but to an Amy Pinto, he's leaving his residence and $10 million. And I have actually taken the time and I have been able to decipher 99% of this document. Here is another from Thomas Kincaid, being of sound mind and body, that terminology that we're looking for. And once again, he's leaving his estate to Amy in order to further his museum. And there is a transcription for this particular page. This is in the surrogate's court in the matter of proving a last will and testament. So a little bit different document. And this one, in terms of the handwriting, really is very clear. There's some loopy scroll, but we fortunately can decipher most of it. Take the time. If you run into one that you cannot, compare it with others. See if you can pick out the names of who are the important persons in it. They are making statements about a certain person. Pick out all the names and see if you can't make sense of the document. We have an inventory from an estate. So you want to try and figure out, what is your ancestor leaving behind? What are people inheriting, or what is being sold to fulfill their estate? We have like one bay mare, one roan colt, one sorrel mare, one cow. I had trouble figuring out cow. A bull. We've got 3 chairs, 1 tablecloth. So looking at the different items, you can hopefully figure out what some of the ones that you can't figure out, one lot of oats. I assume that's one lot of wheat. So we get different items in the household. Land deeds or deeds for real property. These words vary by state. In many cases, you're going to have this indenture, in witness whereof, with the appurtenances, what's coming along with this sale. And it's going to identify who the seller and who the buyer is, the amount of money, and the description of the property. Is it land or is it personal property? Here again, this is one of those. This indenture made on the 10th day of February in the year of our Lord, 1849, between the two parties, John Gibbs of the city of Pittsburgh, of the first part, and Benjamin Sutton. Look, notice, don't confuse that with an L. It looks like an L here as well. And it goes on to describe the terms of the transaction and make some cross references, but you've got lot numbers so that perhaps you can find a map that would identify that lot number. Here is another one for the term terms of 4,250, and I assume that's dollars, but I don't see any L in there. And we have David Burns, his heirs and assigned, the two following tracts of land. And it goes on to describe the first tract of land with 308 acres. And there's a second tract of land that he is selling. Blowing up. We find also in some of these records, this one is a John A. And I believe this is Duncan. I'm not 100% sure on that, has executed his bond to the said, I don't remember, Kingston. Anyway, this is a faded document. It's also unclear. So this is why we want to take the time. It's small, but you blow it up. And you lose some of that contrast, but perhaps by making it a little bit smaller, not as small as that, but smaller, it would help with the clarity of the document. Here's another one that I find really interesting because the scribe has used backhand to identify the people that are involved or the important what he had determined to be important versus the forehand kind of format type stuff. And it actually, this is the appointment of James Wilkinson, having been duly elected sheriff of the county of Saline. So you don't know what kind of document you may find about your ancestor, but this was in court records. So you might discover that your person was appointed or duly elected a sheriff. We have some miscellaneous records. This is an affidavit in terms of applying for a military pension. So this, while the printed form is of a specific format, the writing is going to be a little bit different. And in this case, the doctor is swearing that he has repeatedly treated the soldier during that time, that 4 years ago, he was seriously sick with double pneumonia and never fully recovered, and that he is unable to work, so therefore applying for the pension. You may also get a military appointment. So the Adjutant General, U.S. Army. That's U.S. Army. I have the honor to acknowledge receipt of my commission, Colonel of Cavalry, and my acceptance of same. I return herewith enclosed the required oath of office. Very respectfully, this is Michael Cooney, Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. It was the U.S. that really presented quandary. So, in conclusion, if you're working on your computer screen, you want to enlarge the image. If you can't decipher what it says, try enlarging it to see if that helps you with clarity. In some cases, you may need to shrink the image to get it really clear. We've talked about inverting those positive and negative images to help you decipher some of the writing. Determine the kind of document that you're working with and what might be the prescribed format for that document. You want to read it to get the context and the flow of the document. And in many cases, when reading aloud, your mind will automatically fill in the next logical step. I know I've seen online some of those reading quizzes where they will have a typed paragraph and they will blot out the top of the letters or the bottom of the letters. And they ask if you can decipher this, or they'll print something backwards and ask if you can decipher this. And it usually starts out with, if you can read this, you're a genius or something. Well, try to do the same thing. When reading it aloud, your mind may automatically fill in that next word or next part of the sentence. Look for the common words that you do expect to find: birth, baptism, death, amounts of money, your ancestors' names, and recognize those. Leave blanks for letters or the whole word if you don't know them, and come back later. Compare the stuff. Compare the unknown letters with letters that the scribe has written elsewhere. Don't confuse those capital letters, the capital M's and the capital W's, the capital L's and the capital S's. There are many letters that are known to look like one another. If a person didn't dot the I, is it an I or is it an E? So you need to ask yourself those questions. Try to, when either trace the document that you are reading. In other words, take your pen and go over the letters and try to write the same way the scribe did, because this may give you the clue that you need to figure out. Oh, this is what he was saying. Realize that spelling, punctuation, capitalization, none of that was standardized until the 18th century. And some of the documents that we've looked at today, we haven't seen apostrophes, we haven't seen commas. We haven't always seen capitalization. So when does a sentence end and when does a new one begin? And that might help you to figure out the context of what you are working with. And my final word is have patience. There are times, for example, a couple of the examples that we have seen this morning where I have not been able to figure out the word or a portion of a sentence that we are looking at. So take your time, put it away, come back to the document later. It doesn't have to be the next day even, especially if you've gleaned the important information about your family member. You have figured out the date. You have identified your family member in the document. And do you really need a full translation of the whole document? Are there other documents that you might acquire in the case of a deed, like a map that might help you to locate the actual plot that you are looking for? So have patience, ask a friend, and best wishes to you as you try to decipher. Oops. If you do have any questions, I will be more than happy to entertain those and get back to the museum with an answer for you. And we'll once again talk next month about maps and the different kinds of maps that might be available and what those maps are going to help you to figure out with your ancestor. So I see that there are no questions this morning, and I wish you happy hunting and have patience. Thank you.